You're listening to episode 39 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Evan Thompson joins us to speak about his book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and Philosophy. What happens to your self when you sleep or are unconscious? Are we really simply the manifestation of ongoing processes interacting as they arise and pass, as both Buddhism and contemporary science seem to indicate? Who we are, what we are, changes from moment to moment, and that exploration continues to fascinate, frustrate, and inspire us. Evan Thompson is professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Evan works in the fields of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, phenomenology, and cross-cultural philosophy, especially Asian philosophy and contemporary Buddhist philosophy in dialogue with Western philosophy and science. He is the author of Waking, Dreaming, Being, Self and Consciousness in Neuroscience, Meditation, and Philosophy, Mind in Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, Color Vision, a study in cognitive science and the philosophy of perception, and the co-author of The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience. Our guest today is Evan Thompson. Evan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what I'd like to do to get us started is I normally ask our guests to talk a bit about their background. And you in particular have a rather unique upbringing. And I'm hoping you could share that growing up and what's led you into the different fields that you're involved with.
Well, I grew up for, I suppose, the latter part of my childhood and then my teenage years before I went away to college in a community and institute that my father, William Irwin Thompson, founded in the 1970s. And he was a university professor who taught humanities, history, literature. And in the early 1970s, 1973, he left the university. He left a full professor tenured position at York University in Toronto. And he created his own alternative educational and spiritual, you could say, institute and community in Long Island, in Southampton. And then eventually also it moved into Manhattan. And what he was trying to do, he felt that really universities at the time were not addressing the needs of the culture, and that alternative institutions outside of the university paradigm were needed. And so he created an institution that brought together scientists and artists, poets, philosophers, spiritual teachers from many different contemplative traditions. And the institute was run by a community. So there was a residential community that had a daily rhythm of practicing meditation in the morning and evenings, working, studying, and then running conferences that happen several times a year when philosophers, scientists, artists, ecologists, activists, really a very diverse group of people would come together for periods of about a week and share ideas and talk about the things that they were doing, trying to bring about positive change in the culture at the time. So I grew up as a kid and then as a young teenager, really just being exposed to an incredible variety of ideas, scientific ideas from thinkers like Gregory Bateson, Lynn Margulis, a very prominent, influential biologist, Jim Lovelock, who helped with Margulis create the Gaia theory, the Gaia hypothesis, Francisco Varela, prominent neuroscientist and biologist, spiritual teachers, Buddhist teachers from a wide range of settings in the American Buddhist movement, you could say, Tibetan teachers who would come in the 1970s. We had several Tibetan lamas living with us for about 6 weeks, and that happened through Robert Thurman, who also spoke at Lindisfarne. So I just grew up kind of being exposed to a conversation that was happening amongst many, many different things. And for me, just given my own kind of personal interests, I guess you could say, I was always a very curious, kind of philosophically inclined kid. I naturally gravitated towards those areas of the conversation that really focused on the intersection of science and philosophy and contemplative philosophies underpinning contemplative practices. That's what always really kind of grabbed my attention. And as a result, I got very interested in wanting to study Asian philosophy, and in particular Chinese language and Chinese philosophy. So I went away to college, to go to Amherst College, where I knew Robert Thurman was in the Asian Studies department, and I had met Thurman at some of the conferences, the Lindisfarne meetings that my father had organized. And so I went to Amherst basically with the intention of majoring in Asian studies and studying Asian languages and Asian philosophy, which I did. And because Bob Thurman was there, I focused a lot on Buddhist thinking, though the language that I studied was Chinese. I didn't study Tibetan. And then when it came time to go to graduate school, I decided that what I was really interested in was philosophy. And so I decided to go on and get my PhD in philosophy. And in that period, I also worked with Francisco Varela, who was a neuroscientist and a Buddhist practitioner who had lived with us at the Lindisfarne Association, and who, so this was now, let's say, 1984, 85, and he was just starting to think about writing a book about Buddhism and cognitive science, neuroscience and psychology, drawing on his experience as a Buddhist practitioner, his interest in Buddhist philosophy, and his work as a neuroscientist. And he knew that I was focusing on philosophy of mind and cognitive science in graduate school, and that I had had this undergraduate training in Asian studies and Buddhism. So he brought me to Paris, where he had just moved, to be his research assistant for one summer. And out of that research assistantship grew a collaboration that continued for many years up to his death in 2001. And out of that collaboration came our first book called The Embodied Mind, which really, I think it's fair to say, was one of the first books, certainly the first, I think, academic book. It was published by MIT Press, to talk about the cross-cultural dialogue and exchange between Buddhist philosophy and meditation and the Western sciences of the mind and brain. And that's really what I've been working in one way or another ever since.
And for listeners to the podcast, as we do with every episode, on the page we will be linking to Evan's new book, the one we're going to be talking about, as well as The Embodied Mind, the one he just mentioned, he co-authored. You'll be able to find them right there. And let's dive into the new book, Waking, Dreaming, Being. And in this, you talk about what appear to be varied topics: neuroscience, meditation, philosophy. And I'm wondering if you could describe really what ties them together, the primary subject of the book, and how these relate to it.
The theme of the book is consciousness, and in particular, our consciousness of self, of seeming to have or be a self. And what I try to do in the book is draw on a number of different sources. So these range from neuroscience, Indian philosophy, Buddhism, but also extensively yoga and Advaita Vedanta, Western philosophy, and my own personal experience, as well as things from literature, Western and Asian literature, in order to illuminate how we experience consciousness and awareness and the sense of being or having a self in a range of different settings. So settings that I have in mind are what would happen when you're awake and very attentive versus when your mind wanders or when you daydream. What happens to your awareness and sense of self when you start to fall asleep? You're not fully asleep yet, but you're entering into sleep. What happens to the sense of self and consciousness when you dream? What happens when you have a lucid dream, when you know or are aware of the dream from within the dream? What happens to awareness and the sense of self in deep sleep, where it seems that dreams and mental activities subside or fall away? What happens to awareness and the sense of self in out-of-body experiences? What happens in the dying process when the sense of being a self starts to fall apart? And I try to link all of those things through a narrative that you could say is philosophical, scientific, and experiential, and that draws on the insights, especially of contemplative experience and the contemplative philosophies, especially in the Indian tradition, that you could say theoretically underpin contemplative practices. So if one were to sort of summarize the theme of the book, it would be that the self, or the sense of being or having a self, is a constantly enacted process. The self isn't a thing or an entity. It's a process that's under constant construction and transformation, and that can be seen in different ways through all of these different states.
Yeah, you make an interesting point in the book when you're talking about this sense of self when one has slept, even in a dreamless sleep, that when you awake, there's a sense of, I had a good rest. That there is still this sense that you were, however unconscious you may have been, and not dreaming, lucid or otherwise, that there was a sense of time passing, and that the traditions point to there is a subtle form of consciousness there that isn't something we've so much considered in the West. Did you find that to be an interesting, different way of looking at it?
Definitely. So that's something I spent some time talking about and that I try to emphasize, is that in the Indian traditions, Indian philosophical and contemplative traditions, deep and dreamless sleep is described or conceptualized as a state of subtle awareness or subtle consciousness, not as a state in which consciousness is entirely absent, which is the standard way that you see it described in neuroscience today. So, for example, neuroscientists and Western philosophers who take their lead from neuroscience will often say things like, well, if we want to try to define consciousness, we can define it as that which disappears in dreamless sleep and reappears when you wake up or when you dream. From an Indian philosophical perspective, that's not a very satisfactory definition, because the view there is that in dreamless sleep, there is a subtle awareness or consciousness that's still present, that is evidenced by, when you wake up, the feeling that you have of having been just asleep, or the sense of some passage of time. And in the Indian traditions, this goes along with a very important distinction between what we could call the contents of awareness, so what your awareness is of from moment to moment, versus the process of awareness itself, sometimes described as a kind of witness or watching awareness. So, in fact, it's in a way easier to illustrate this distinction in the case of lucid dreaming. So, when you're dreaming, the content of your awareness is what you're dreaming about, all of the images and thoughts that fill up the dream world. But in a lucid dream, when you become aware of the dream as a dream, then there's a sense in which you can simply be present to, mindfully, we could say, the dream state as such, and that's a different kind of awareness that can't be identified with any transient content that makes up the dream state. So this distinction is carried over as well into thinking about dreamless sleep, in the sense that just because there's no obvious or overt contents that are present, discursive or ruminative thoughts or dream images, doesn't mean that there isn't still a subtler quality of awareness that's present. So I try to explore this difference between the contemporary Western neuroscience conception of consciousness in dreamless sleep or its absence, and an Indian conception that's also very much tied to meditative practices of treating sleep as an occasion for meditation, the process of falling asleep as an occasion for developing mindfulness. I talk about these differences, and in a way, the message for me in that chapter is not about saying, well, the Indian tradition is right and the Western tradition is wrong, but more to juxtapose the traditions in a way that would suggest a new way of thinking about how to do sleep science. That is, to carry out sleep science in a way that's much more richly informed by contemplative practices of sleep, where sleep is treated as an occasion for meditation, because that's just not been on the radar for sleep science since it started, say, in the 1950s, really.
Imagine your own background in both your upbringing that you shared about and in the areas that you've pursued as something to study ongoing, that for you, there's maybe not quite as much of a mental shift between thinking with your philosophy hat on and your contemplative practitioner hat on and your neuroscience hat on, but that really these are all very closely interrelated for you. Do you find that helps in this exploration?
It definitely helps. I mean, I'm constantly weaving back and forth between these different materials and traditions and ways of thinking. So this is possible for me, or this is natural for me, I suppose I would say, in part because of, the upbringing that I had that I described earlier, and also because I've just been very fortunate to be able to participate in rich conversations and dialogues where these different voices are present and are interacting with each other, in the context of my upbringing at the Lindisfarne Association, or in my work through the Mind and Life Institute and the dialogues with the Dalai Lama. So these occasions are places where I've been able to really see these different perspectives in interaction. And as a philosopher, that provides material for philosophical thought and philosophical reflection. So, I try to collaborate with scientists in some of the work that I do, with experimental scientists. I lean very heavily on friends who are, Buddhist scholars in a way that I'm not, who really, know the Sanskrit and the Tibetan and work from, a historical, philological perspective. And I try to, learn from these different kinds of intellectual approaches in order to really enrich my work as a philosopher.
So as we talk a little bit about consciousness, an experience that many of us, myself included, when we undergo surgery and we're in an anesthetic, that the passage of time that we have when we sleep over hours, we have that same sense, isn't quite the same thing, that we get put under and then suddenly we're waking up and there's no sense of time. It just seems like an instant has passed, even though it may have been hours later. And I'm wondering if that, along with these different aspects of consciousness in waking and dreaming, if that contributes a bit to your own thoughts on the dependency of consciousness on physicality, on the brain and the neural networks and the embodiment of this process.
So from my perspective, so this is another theme that runs throughout the new book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, the theme of, let's say, embodiment and consciousness as a bodily or embodied phenomenon. I think of consciousness as very much dependent on the living body. You could even say as a life regulation process of the body itself, that consciousness for me at its most fundamental is, you could say, the feeling of being alive. And when you emerge from anesthesia, that's in a way the first, I'm not speaking from experience here, I'm actually speaking from things that people have told me, especially my father, who's undergone surgery a number of times, that what in a way emerges first as you come out of anesthesia is just the sheer feeling of existence, the feeling of being alive. It's not necessarily a thought or a particular image or sensory content, but that that bare phenomenon of sentience, you could say. So that very much for me points to the contingency or the dependence of consciousness on the organism and on the body. And this is something that has come up, of course, in our exchanges with Buddhist thinkers and with the Dalai Lama, where the conception of consciousness is really different fundamentally, at least in some contexts. And this is something that I explore in the book. You could say the relationship of mind and body, the relationship of consciousness and body, because from some Buddhist perspectives, consciousness is not fundamentally a physical phenomenon. It has a different nature. At least in some traditional Buddhist philosophical frameworks, there's a very strong dualism between the non-physical luminous nature of consciousness and the physical nature of the body. This is complicated in tantric contexts where you do have an interrelationship that comes back into the story, but you have a conception of the physical that's much more tied to the feeling of subtle energy in the body. So these are things that weave throughout the book, and in my own case, I would say that one of the themes of the book is the way in which certain phenomena of consciousness that might seem experientially to transcend the body or embodiment, like out-of-body experiences, that actually, when we look at these carefully, they point us back to the dependence of consciousness on the body.
Yeah, let's explore that a little bit, because you do discuss at great length out-of-body experiences. And I'm wondering if you could share just some of what you've learned about those, because there is for many an impression that I had an experience, it was extremely compelling, and therefore it is something that really did happen. There was an I that was detached from my body, and I went out and about. Tell us a little bit about what your own research and work has found about this.
Well, that's a particularly interesting one for me because I have had out-of-body experiences, some quite vivid and compelling ones, especially when I was a kid. So I definitely, when people say I had an out-of-body experience and I felt I was not the same as my body, that I was separate from my body, I could see things that were happening in places that my body wouldn't be able to see. I very much understand that experientially because I've had those kinds of experiences myself. What's interesting, though, is if you examine those experiences very carefully, it turns out that experientially, they involve various kinds of feelings that are bodily feelings. So often, out-of-body experiences, vestibular sensations are present, so sensations of floating, sensations of being oriented in a space that has up and down and back and front and left and right. So in other words, a body-oriented space. So those are just phenomenologically or experientially speaking, ways of experiencing things that bring with them or that have as an essential part of them a sense of embodiment, even if there's a dissociation where you're seeing, for example, your body in the bed below you from an elevated perspective. The fact that it's elevated or that you've floated up there, that's a vestibular bodily sensation. So that's just on the experiential level. Now, on the neuroscience level, one of the things we're learning now that we didn't know, for example, when I was a kid in the 70s and had some of these very vivid experiences, is that there are brain systems and areas of the brain that we now know are very much a crucial basis for these kinds of experiences. And that if you stimulate these areas, you can bring about aspects of out-of-body experiences. Individuals who suffer from certain kinds of either epilepsy or certain kinds of neural damage, they're more likely to report these kinds of experiences. So my point wouldn't be that we can just reduce these experiences to brain activity in the sense that if you just kind of open up the brain and look inside, all of a sudden you understand everything there is to know about these experiences. To understand them, you need to sort of grasp them as experiential phenomena. But the inference that we might make from their being so subjectively compelling to there being in some way evidence for a disembodied consciousness, that I think simply doesn't hold up when we really examine both the phenomenology and the biology. So in my book, I have a chapter devoted entirely to out-of-body experiences, and I recount some of my own experiences where in the world in which I was raised, I told my parents about these experiences, and they interpreted them for me very much in a yoga framework in terms of subtle energy bodies, a body that isn't a physical body that can separate from the physical body, that can journey elsewhere. And that was the way I understood these experiences as a kid, and through my teens and even into my 20s. And I mean, that map was a very valuable map for me because it helped me make sense of my experiences. It gave me a way to understand them and not to think of them as somehow saying something about me that was dysfunctional, for example. But when I then started to really study them more from a kind of analytical, phenomenological perspective and investigating the neuroscience, then I started to think, well, the inference that seems so compelling, that there is a separate astral body or energetic body that can travel in its own realm, that just doesn't hold up in terms of the evidence. And that was actually kind of a personally, it was personally wrenching in a way to go through that journey. Now I feel it was kind of exhilarating that, oh, I learned something, and as a philosopher, that's what's important, is a kind of path of discovery and learning. But when I was younger, really grappling with these things, it was a challenge to my worldview and to things that I had been raised to think, and that's certainly not an easy process to go through.
Mm-hmm. No, learning can be very, very difficult, particularly when it's something that we have found very deeply meaningful and transformative in our lives. To see that in a very different way than the one we were expecting can be quite jarring and difficult. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on something you say in the beginning of the book. I think you have it in the introduction, that you do describe this dependence on a physical body for this selfing and consciousness, that ongoing process. But you also mentioned that you don't see this as a strictly materialistic worldview. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So that's actually, I think, a very important point, because someone might think, on the basis of everything that I just said a moment ago, that, he started out raised, in a kind of, hippie yogi context, and then he became a materialist. That's actually not the story. I mean, the story for me is that materialism is a worldview that basically says two things. It says that we can understand everything through, let's say, science as we presently understand science. So that's a kind of claim about, it's an epistemological claim in philosophical jargon. It's a claim about, how we know things, that the methodology of experimental science, where the paradigm is physics, that's our best way of knowing things. And then secondly, it says, given that that's our best way of knowing things, and it tells us that everything is ultimately physical, then we should be materialists. So that's not my view for two reasons. One, I think that there are certain things that just can't be known except experientially. And in order to understand the knowing process, we need a phenomenological perspective. So that's on the knowledge epistemology side. Then on the metaphysical or ontological side, the fact of the matter is that we don't, as a matter of present day scientific understanding, have any kind of worked out and developed theory of consciousness that tells us how consciousness comes to be as a phenomenon in the natural world. Now, what I take from that is, on the one hand, we have all this information that tells us that consciousness is really bound up with the body and the brain and the phenomenon of being alive. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to think that somehow our present conception of matter or of what it is to be physical does justice to the reality of that. It simply doesn't. So, I mean, to put it another way, consciousness is an outstanding scientific problem. And from my perspective, we really need to have a kind of deep revision in how we think about the nature of the physical and the nature of the mental, so that these concepts aren't opposed to each other anymore, so that we can understand how consciousness emerges, but not in a way from something that we conceive of as fundamentally opposed to or by nature different from consciousness, which is presently how we think of physical reality. I mean, to put it yet another way, I don't think we're going to have deep insight into this without, some revolutionary things happening in science. But what I do think we can have some, pretty good reasons for being confident of is that consciousness in the sense of awareness that involves a sense of self and identification with certain things that one is aware of as being self versus not self, that kind of, let's call it cognitive consciousness, really is, I think, bodily dependent. It depends on the phenomenon of a living organism. And I see that as very much in keeping with a very old Buddhist idea that we see in the early Buddhist suttas, the Pali Nikayas, the Pali text, where the Buddha says that consciousness and name and form, nama rupa, that these are interdependent, where consciousness means awareness and name and form means, well, I suppose what we today could call the whole kind of psychophysical complex of the organism. The Buddha says in one of his teachings, he says, wherever there is name and form, there is consciousness, and where there is consciousness, there is name and form. And he uses this image of two sheaves of reeds that prop each other up. So there's a mutual dependency. And he does this, interestingly, in reply to someone who mistakenly attributes to him the view of consciousness that we see in the Upanishads, which says that consciousness is the same as the ultimate ground of being, that consciousness is ultimately Brahman, and it is what travels from one life to the next. And the Buddha says, mistaken man, I've never said that. What I've always said is that consciousness is contingent on name and form. So where there's eye consciousness, there is the form eye. Where there is ear consciousness, there is the form ear. And I see that as a kind of, let's call it non-dualism, as not a materialistic reductionism and not a mind-body dualism.
Yeah, that there's an ongoing mutuality of process, ever changing with many factors involved, not just one single monolithic thing. So I'd also like to give you the opportunity to share what you feel are some of the takeaways that you're hoping readers will get from the book.
That's a great question. I suppose if I were going to say one thing, it would be that I would hope readers would find the ideas and the material that I use fruitful for experiencing their own waking and dreaming life in an enriched way. That when I, relate my own experiences of dreaming, or when I draw on literature to illustrate certain aspects of what it is to be immersed in a dream, or what it is to become aware of a dream, or what it is to wonder whether you're still dreaming or whether you've woken up, that those discussions, drawing on what we know from the brain science side and what philosophy over the centuries in Western and Eastern contexts has had to say about those experiences, that would give readers new things that they could take into their own experience of these phenomena. I've had some people, write to me and say, oh, I'm paying more attention to my dreams now, or, oh, I see things about my dreams differently now that, I've been reading your book. And that for me is like the greatest compliment. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything in terms of my philosophical position. I mean, I am trying to argue for it as best I can because that's what philosophers do, but I'm not interested in, trying to get people to think, the same things that I think. I'm trying to get them to see this incredibly rich terrain of consciousness and the self in a way that, enriches their own experience. So that would be sort of my greatest hope for the book, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think you do that very well in the book because you bring in to bear that experience you have in your own background of straddling and moving and swimming in these supposedly different disciplines. And you blur those lines, which for many of us are fairly hard and fast. And it encourages this creative exploration of what do we really mean by this? What might that be like for us to live in that space for a little bit and not be limited quite as much as we are by our perceptions? So something else I'd like you to do, if you're willing to take a few minutes, you mentioned these dialogues with Dalai Lama, and you do point out in the book some of the, what may be rather surprising in light of his position as the leader of one of the main traditions of Buddhism, that the Dalai Lama has made statements about this dependence of self-consciousness on a physical presence, on a physical body. And so much of this has come from the work of Francisco Varela. And I was wondering if you'd take a few minutes and talk about him and his role in contemplative science, as some of the listeners may not be familiar with his work and how very important it has been.
Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. Francisco Varela was a neuroscientist or really a neurobiologist by training, and he was from Chile. He died in 2001. He was really an exceptional, remarkable individual. I first met him when I was 14 years old, and I met him through my father, William Merwin Thompson, at the Lindisfarne Association. So he came to a conference that was called Mind in Nature, that my father and Gregory Bateson, who was an anthropologist and a cybernetic systems theory thinker, they organized this conference in 1977, brought Francisco Varela to the conference, and then Francisco Varela lived with us at Lindisfarne as a scholar in residence. So my experience of him was as a friend, as a mentor, as an older brother or an uncle, you could say, as a collaborator. And he was, in terms of the work that he did, he was known for, first of all, developing with his mentor, Umberto Maturana, the theory of living systems, or what it is to be alive or to be a living being or living system, that goes under the heading of the word autopoiesis. So this is a word that they coined that means, literally from the Greek, self-making, autopoiesis, poiesis being the word from which we get poetry, making or production. And the basic idea that they had with this theory was that what it is to be a living system is to be constantly producing and making your own innards, your own metabolic constituents in a way that keeps yourself going as a unity through time. And they developed this in a rigorous theoretical and mathematical way. And it was a precursor to all sorts of things that happened in theoretical biology and computational system science. So that was one domain in which he was very well known. Another domain in which he was very well known, just still speaking strictly within the frame of science, was for his work on complex, large-scale brain activities. So towards the end of his life, he was one of the pioneers in showing that brain systems, what they do in order to support a moment of awareness, say in perception, is they synchronize their activities in various different frequencies and rhythms. And he developed some techniques for measuring this and did some experimental work that was very instrumental in showing how this synchrony, this neural synchrony, comes about. So this is just talking within the scientific frame. But at the same time, he was an exceptional individual because he was a Buddhist practitioner. He came to Buddhism through Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in the 70s when he had just fled Chile during the coup, the other September 11th that Americans don't know as much about, which was September 11th, 1973, when the government of Allende was brought down. And he was associated with people in Allende's government. And so he and his family had to flee. They left Chile, they went to Costa Rica, and eventually he moved to Boulder, where he was at the University of Colorado. And he met Trungpa Rinpoche at a point in his life when he felt it was an existential crisis. He had been forced to flee his homeland. His whole world had fallen apart. He had been trained at Harvard as a biologist and had gone back to Chile to try to build science in his country. And this had just been pulled out from under him. And there he was back in the United States. And of course, the United States, the United States government had been complicitous or instrumental in bringing down Allende. So this was just a huge period of crisis for him. And he, I think maybe through a friend, met Trungpa Rinpoche, and Trungpa gave him meditation instructions. And this had a profound effect on Francisco, so that he just practiced really for several years as a student of Trungpa's, and then eventually through that became more and more interested in Buddhist philosophy and discovered the richness of Buddhist thinking particularly about the mind, and became then very interested in how the Buddhist tradition of philosophy and practice could interact and dialogue and debate with the Western tradition of science and philosophy. And of course, he held these two things within himself in a unique and exceptional way. He eventually met the Dalai Lama and was the founding scientist of the Mind and Life Institute that started these dialogues between Western scientists and the Dalai Lama and other Tibetan monks and scholars over many years. And it was really his vision of the science-Buddhism interface that led to these dialogues happening. So he was really an exceptional and pioneering individual in these many different ways that crossed many different things and created new formations and new conversations in our culture and in the Tibetan context. I think it's fair to say that the Dalai Lama would not have been able to bring science into the Tibetan Buddhist worldview and even into the monastic curriculum if it hadn't been for his friendship with Francisco Varela and his dialogues with him.
Yeah, you included in your book on page 70, you talk about the 9th Mind and Life Dialogue at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Francisco was not able to attend. He was very ill at that point. And you say that on the final day of the meeting, because Francisco was attending via live webcam, the Dalai Lama looked into the video camera and gave his own message to Francisco. I'd like to, if it's all right with you, read just that brief passage from your book.
Yes, please.
Dalai Lama looked into the video camera and said, "Good morning, my dear friend. And in some sense, I also consider you as a spiritual brother. I didn't realize what a strong feeling it is missing you here. I heard you were watching our meeting yesterday and also today, so I wanted to express my deep feeling to you as a human brother and to your contribution. In science, especially in neurology, you've made great contributions, and also in our work on the dialogue between the science of the mind and Buddhist thought. So we'll never forget that. Until my death, I will remember you." I think that was a wonderful way to clearly show what a tremendous impact that he has had on this ongoing process of learning. Evan, is there anything else that you'd care to share with the audience before we close today's discussion?
Well, we managed to cover quite a bit of ground. We talked about consciousness and self and Francisco Varela and the Dalai Lama. And I think the only thing I would want to say is that with this book, I see it as really a continuation of this conversation that Francisco was really instrumental in bringing about. And my hope would be that it's the conversation as a whole that really speaks to people and that they can take from to, enrich their own experience in their day-to-day lives.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And for people who are listening to the podcast, we will have links to Evan's books that he's referenced here, especially the one we've been talking about today. So you'll be able to get those links to Amazon right from there. And we'll also link to Evan's site, evanthompson.me, which you can check out. Evan, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.